All right, everybody. So today, when we start our new unit on Unit 8 about the Industrial Revolution and the Progressives, it's important to understand that this unit happens essentially at the same time as our previous unit on Reconstruction, and they're happening simultaneously. Now, Reconstruction and all the components of the Jim Crow laws and such, that's all happening in the American South. And so, really, the reason we look at these two units together is because they happen simultaneously, but they're happening in different regions of the United States. Okay, at this point, we have the South, we have the North, of course, and then where we will start today is going to be the West. And after the Civil War, though the West and the North are going to have very different stories than what the American South was having during Reconstruction era. And following the Civil War, a lot of Americans did decide to move west. To explore a lot of that region now that the war had ended and a lot of the territory and things that they were accustomed to had been either destroyed or even hurt even more. And so during this time period, we're going to see a massive expansion. Within 100 years, the United States has essentially not only taken almost all of this territory you see on the map, but has now explored it and settled it. You're going to start seeing by 1880s the formation of all the territory, or the states and territories that we recognize. By the 1880s, we're going to also have Alaska, and only Hawaii was still to go. So it is definitely emerging, and the United States is really taking form and starting to realize the power and the influence that comes along with that. And so the years immediately after the Civil War were what we call the era of the cowboy. A lot of people were moving west. This was a time where they had the railroads, but by and large, the West was largely unsettled. And so many people were using the open plains of the West for cattle drives and getting cattle to market out on the Great Plains. And they were out there because our government encouraged them to go. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln actually created a law called the Homestead Act, which encouraged individuals to move west by giving them free public land. The requirement was that they had to stay there for a certain amount of time, roughly about 5 years. They had to establish it and create, a housing settlement there. But once they did that, the land itself was free. The United States had so much of it that they were really trying to push people to settle out there and settle in these different regions. Now, Southerners, in particular African Americans, were all about this. Many of them, if they did not go north, they also did go west because free land was a pretty good opportunity, especially for former slaves to really get started and get a jump start on life when they would have had very little after the war due to being a slave. And so, yes, the advantage to north was finding a job. You would have found more. You would have had more factories and things that would have given you terms of employment. But west, there was opportunity to get land, and so it was kind of like pick your choice, And it wasn't that it was easy. Certainly, new technologies allowed for these open lands in the west to settle. Things like the railroads that allowed goods to come out to the west from the eastern factories. The mechanical reaper, which allowed them to harvest goods like wheat and corn much easier and faster. Those things were all great, but it was hard. It was very hard to settle unclaimed land and to settle really a rugged territory like that and, live a life that would have been similar to that in the South or the East. It takes time. It takes a lot of time. And, the railroad certainly helped. This is actually how one company, Sears, got its start. They would start over here on the East Coast. Get my pointer out. They would start over here on the East Coast, and they would actually ship they would send the train out to people who lived in the West, and people in the West, they would get a magazine, and that magazine would have a list of products that they wanted and things that they would try to use, and they would order it. They would hand their order form to the conductor, and the conductor would take it back to the East on the rail here. And he would take it to the factory would make it, and then on his second trip back out to the West, he would deliver these products. And that's really how the Sears company got its start. These railroads were essentially their link to civilization. So that railroad was created in 1869. It was put together at Promontory Point, and after that, it was, really the connecting point between East and West. And now, the settlement of that area is going to drastically expand. The only problem with this is that they weren't the first ones there. And unfortunately, during this time period, we're going to see an old familiar theme of the forcible removal of Native Americans during this time. Manifest destiny, this idea that God, ordained our expansion, did not do much or did not leave a lot of room for native tribes that had already lived there. And a lot of tragedies like Little Bighorn, Sand Creek, and the massacre at Wounded Knee are going to really reveal that as the United States moved west, we did not do a good job of establishing positive relationships with the people that had already lived there. Wounded Knee is going to be one of those cases where a group of American infantry slaughtered a Native American tribe. And there's a mass grave there still, the Sioux Indians at Wounded Knee. Here's what it looks like today. But just a very, very sad story when it comes to moving west. And that could have, possibly been better, for sure. So that's the story of the West in a nutshell. We then move to the North. And in the North, the story is very different. In the North, we had the Industrial Revolution. We really had the complete transformation of the North from a somewhat agricultural economy and fishing economy and shipbuilding to a complete industrialized economy. And when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, it's important to understand that we're talking about the increase of cities, we're talking about the increase of mechanized goods and products, goods made by machines. But really, the Industrial Revolution is going to happen in two different phases, okay? At first, the Industrial Revolution is first going to really introduce the advantages of doing things by machine, increased efficiency, increased output. And we're going to move away from this picture on the left where we see a lot of cottage industries. I like to call them ma and pa shops where a family might create some products that were very well made and hand done, but were slow. And introduced, a mechanized way of creating things that were not only faster, but were simpler. And allowed for workers who didn't have skill, or in some horrible cases, very young workers, to do a job that might have previously been unattainable. And so the first phase of the Industrial Revolution was really based on the production of cotton. Before the Civil War, a lot of inventions like the cotton gin and the steam engine, the spinning jenny, really facilitated the movement of cotton into factories to create textiles and clothing. And a lot of this emerged from the British want for that cotton, which is why the South had such an economic influence before the Civil War. But after the Civil War is where we really see the greatest phase of change, of economic and territorial expansion. And this is going to be the moment where the United States will finally pass Great Britain as an industrial power. This is our stepping onto the world stage, folks, and taking control. And during the late 1800s, we're going to transform from an agricultural economy to a modern industrial economy. And our population is going to move from being mostly rural to urban, which means they're going to move more from countrysides into the cities. And we're going to see a really, really drastic change over a period of a couple of decades. And it's going to be good and bad. There's always a positive and negative to every change that happens, it seems, in our history class so far. And the advancements that we are going to make in technology and industry is going to make us not only the industrialized country in the world, but it's going to make us the wealthiest country in the world. It's really going to allow us to become a world leader, but it comes at a pretty intense cost. It comes at the result of a lot of social problems, a lot of economic issues that we're going to have to deal with over the next few decades and into the early 1900s. Some of the examples are here. Factory workers are going to face horrible conditions. At first, they're going to be paid very little, essentially, cents on the dollar to do jobs that are backbreaking and very labor intensive. When they started to move into the city, it was a while before cities really figured out how to respond to the massive influx of people. And so urban living conditions for the working class are going to be very inadequate, even unhealthy and discouraging. In some of the worst cases, these apartments, these tenement housing, are actually going to be made out of wood, and if it catches fire, that could tear down an entire apartment building with people who might be inside. You're also going to see a massive movement of immigrants into our country, and this is where America is going to really get that label as a melting pot, or what I like to refer to as a mixed salad. And a lot of immigrants are going to come in, but they're going to receive a lot of discrimination. They're going to receive a lot of harassment for not being from our country. And unfortunately, we're going to see a big nativist movement, which is going to be a movement to really try to keep America from having more immigrants coming in. You can see here on a flag here of a political party that actually was created around this. We're also going to see corruption in politics. Politics are going to be corrupt for various reasons. The massive amount of money that's starting to flow into people's pockets is going to make them make decisions that might not have been very good. We're going to talk about people like Boss Tweed and a lot of industrialists who made decisions based on money, maybe not on the public good. And then finally, we're also going to see businesses like monopolies start to take control. And industrialists, who are the factory owners, are going to start really wielding their power and throwing their weight around to establish monopolies that control the workers' lives. So this era of industrial revolution is interesting because we refer to it as historians as the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a term coined by the author Mark Twain. You might know him for writing Huckleberry Finn. But Twain looked at this and he said, yes, America is progressing, and yes, America is doing very, very well during the 1800s in terms of a country perspective, but the individuals' lives were not really getting better. Unless you were a factory owner, you worked very long hours, maybe 12-hour days, and you received very little pay for it. And so what Mark Twain was meaning when he called it the Gilded Age is for something to be gilded, it means to take a lesser metal or a lesser material and cover it in gold to make it look better than it really is. That's the art of gilding. And so he talks about the Industrial Revolution as a gilded age because on the surface, it looks very good. On the surface, it makes America a power. It makes us very influential and wealthy. But underneath was corruption. Underneath was inadequate working conditions, inadequate health care, riots and strikes. And so the day-to-day life during the Gilded Age is very tough, but it is something that allows our country to really progress in a very short amount of time. So as we go throughout our unit, we're going to talk about these examples of the good and the bad. And when we come back to class next time, our first topic that we'll talk about is, in fact, immigration. So that's all for today. Hopefully you got all the notes filled out. Have a good afternoon.